February 14th, 1933, 4:32 a.m., a basement in Harlem. 12 men, armed, waiting in the dark. Their target? One man, unarmed, walking down those stairs knowing exactly what waited for him. It was supposed to be simple, 12 against 1. No witnesses, no way out. But 90 minutes later, the door creaked open, and only one person walked out alive. He carried something in his hand, a message that would change everything. See, everyone expected a massacre that night. What they didn't realize was that the 12 men weren't the hunters. They were the ones trapped in there with him. This is the story of how Bumpy Johnson lost $50,000 overnight, and by sunrise, knew exactly who stole it, and exactly how to get it back, without firing a single shot. To understand this story, you need to understand Harlem in 1933. The Great Depression had its knee on America's neck. Unemployment was 25% nationwide. In Harlem, it was worse, 40%. Jobs were gone. Hope was scarce. But there was one industry that never stopped. They called it the policy. Most people know it as the numbers game. It was simple. You picked 3 numbers, bet a penny, a nickel, maybe a dime. If your number hit, you got paid, 600 to 1. A nickel bet could win you $30. In 1933, $30 fed a family for a month. It could save you from eviction. That wasn't just gambling. That was survival. That was hope. And the money? Tens of thousands of dollars every single week, flowing through Harlem in untraceable cash. The people controlling that money? They controlled Harlem. In 1933, 2 people controlled the numbers. Stephanie St. Clair. They called her Madam Queen, a Caribbean immigrant who built the entire operation from nothing. Fierce, sophisticated, wealthy. And her partner, the enforcer, the strategist, 27 years old, Bumpy Johnson. Now, if you hear the name Bumpy and picture a brainless thug, you're making the same mistake Dutch Schultz made. Bumpy wasn't just muscle. He was a chess master. He read Shakespeare and Nietzsche. He studied law in prison. He understood that in a war against forces bigger than you can't just outshoot them. You have to outthink them. And in February 1933, Bumpy was about to need every ounce of that intelligence. Because Harlem's money didn't go unnoticed. Someone was watching. Someone with guns. Someone with ambition. Someone who thought Harlem was wide open for the taking. His name was Dutch Schultz, and he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Dutch Schultz, the Bronx beer baron, born Arthur Flegenheimer. If you picture a gangster as smooth and diplomatic, erase that image. Schultz was a blunt instrument. He was brutal. He was Tanyan. He was the kind of man who settled disputes with lead pipes and shotguns. By 1933, Schultz controlled bootlegging across the Bronx and Manhattan. He'd made millions during Prohibition. But Prohibition was ending. The liquor money was drying up. Schultz needed a new revenue stream. And he looked uptown. He saw Harlem's numbers game. He saw tens of thousands of dollars flowing every week. He saw black operators running the show. And he thought, easy pickings. To Schultz, Harlem was soft, unprotected, ripe for takeover. He didn't see a community. He saw a cash cow. In January 1933, Schultz made his move. He sent men into Harlem, big sedans with Bronx plates, men in heavy coats. They didn't ask nicely. They walked into betting stations, beat up runners, threw bricks through windows, left messages, work for Dutch or die. Most operators folded immediately. They looked at Schultz's guns. They looked at the police, who ignored his violence. They surrendered. Within weeks, Schultz controlled half of Harlem's numbers game. He thought he'd won, but Schultz made one critical error. He assumed fear always works. He didn't realize that when you back a community into a corner, When you try to take the only thing they have left, you don't create submission. You create something far more dangerous. You create Bumpy Johnson. On February 13th, 1933, Schultz sent a final message. One of Bumpy's counting houses was hit hard. Men came through the skylight and back door simultaneously. Shotguns leveled. They pistol-whipped the counters, smashed furniture, and they took the money. All of it. $50,000. The entire week's take. The money Bumpy needed to pay winners. Schultz didn't just steal cash. He attacked Bumpy's reputation. In the numbers game, if you can't pay winners, you're finished. By sunrise on February 14th, Bumpy Johnson had a choice. Run, or fight a war he couldn't win. Most men would have run. Bumpy did something different. He went hunting. February 14th, 1933, 5:15 a.m. Bumpy Johnson stood in the wreckage of the counting house. Empty cash boxes, blood on the floor, the smell of kerosene where they'd burned betting slips. Total destruction. Most men would have panicked, called for backup, prepared for war. Bumpy did none of that. He calculated. See? Here's what Schultz didn't understand about Bumpy Johnson. Violence was easy. Any thug could shoot someone. But Bumpy wasn't interested in easy. He was interested in messages. In psychology, in making sure his response echoed for years. Bumpy called a meeting, not with his enforcers, with his runners. The kids who collected bets on street corners. The old men who knew every face in every building. The women who ran the betting stations in beauty parlors and barber shops. He asked them one question. Who's been asking questions about the counting house? Within 2 hours, Bumpy had 12 names. Schultz's crew. The men who'd been casing the location for weeks. The men who knew exactly when the money would be there. The men who'd stolen $50,000. Bumpy didn't call the police. The police were on Schultz's payroll. He didn't call other gangsters for help. This was personal. This was about respect. This was about sending a message so clear that nobody would ever try this again. At 9 a.m., Bumpy sent word. A meeting. Neutral ground. A basement on 140th Street. Just talk. No violence. Schultz's men laughed when they got the message. Bumpy Johnson wants to negotiate? After they'd just stolen everything? This would be easy. They'd go to the meeting. Show him who's really in charge. Maybe rough him up a little. Make sure he understood. Harlem belongs to Dutch now. 12 men agreed to go. They brought guns. Thompson submachine guns. Sawed-off shotguns. 38 revolvers. Enough firepower to start a small war. They walked into that basement at 11:47 p.m. on February 14th. Confident. Armed. Ready. They had no idea what was about to happen. 11:47 p.m. February 14th, 1933. A basement on 140th Street. The location was a storage cellar beneath a tenement. Not glamorous. Not clean. Damp concrete walls. The smell of coal dust and rotting wood. Illegal moonshine stacked in crates. One single light bulb hanging from a frayed wire in the center of the ceiling. It swayed slightly, casting long shadows that danced across the brick walls. Bumpy Johnson walked down the narrow wooden stairs. Step, creak, step, creak. His Italian leather shoes hit the cold basement floor. Then he heard it. Click-clack. The unmistakable sound of a pump-action shotgun being racked. Then the metallic slide of a Thompson submachine gun. Then, revolver hammers clicking. One man stepped out from behind crates. Then another. Then 3 more from the darkness near the coal chute. They kept coming. 12 men. 12 hired killers from the Bronx. Men with scarred faces and cold eyes. Men who didn't know Bumpy Johnson. Didn't care about his reputation. Just cared about the job. They were holding enough firepower to level a city block. Tommy guns with drum magazines, sawed-off shotguns, snub nose, 38 seconds for finishing work. Now here's where the record ends, and the legend begins. There are no police reports for what happened in that basement. No forensic evidence. This story comes from the streets, whispered in barber shops on Lenox Avenue, told in the back rooms of jazz clubs, passed down from father to son. Some historians say it's impossible. They say no man could stand in a room with 12 armed assassins and live. But in Harlem, this story is gospel. Picture the scene. 12 barrels leveled at one chest. The exit blocked by 2 men with baseball bats. The air so quiet you could hear the light bulb buzzing. In a situation like that, most men freeze. Their knees buckle. They beg. But Bumpy didn't freeze. He didn't beg. While the hitmen were tightening their fingers on triggers, Bumpy was doing what he always did. He was calculating. He wasn't looking at the guns. He was looking at the angles. He noticed the spacing. They were clustered too close together in the narrow space, blocking each other's lines of fire. He noticed the heavy oak table to his left, covered in a thick tarp. He noticed the floor was slick with condensation. He analyzed the geometry of violence. He realized something critical. If they opened fire all at once in this confined concrete box, the ricochets would be just as dangerous to them as to him. The leader stepped forward, a massive enforcer in a trench coat. He held his shotgun low, aiming at Bumpy's stomach. He smiled. It was a cruel, confident smile. He wanted to savor this. "End of the line, boy," he whispered. The silence stretched out, thin and tight as a piano wire. Dust motes danced in the yellow cone of light. The smell of gun oil and fear was suffocating. Every second felt like an hour. The other hitmen shifted their weight, boots scraping on grit, getting restless. Why wasn't he screaming? Bumpy just stood there. He adjusted his cufflinks. He looked the leader in the eye, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. He didn't say a word. He just waited. He waited for the exact microsecond when the leader's focus drifted. And then, he moved. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't lunge. He did the one thing they hadn't accounted for. He looked up at the light bulb. He didn't draw a gun. He drew a knife, not to attack the men, to attack the environment. With a flick of his wrist faster than thought, steel flashed through the air. Pop! The single light bulb shattered. The basement was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. And that's when the professor taught them the most painful lesson of their lives. Panic is more dangerous than any bullet. See? Bumpy had calculated the psychology perfectly. He knew that 12 men with itchy trigger fingers standing in a circle in pitch black wouldn't hold fire. They would react to sound. They would react to fear. The first shot was accidental, a reflex. But in a room full of killers, one shot is a signal. Suddenly, the basement erupted. It wasn't a tactical engagement. It was a meat grinder. The Bronx hitmen opened fire blindly into the dark. The muzzle flashes from the Thompson guns acted like strobe lights, freezing horrific vignettes of chaos for a split second before plunging the room back into blackness. Rat-a-tat-tat. The roar was deafening in the concrete box. The air instantly filled with the acrid sting of cordite. The smell of burning wood. They were screaming orders, but they couldn't hear each other over the gunfire. They were shooting at shadows. They were shooting at the sound of footsteps. They were shooting each other. And Bumpy Johnson? He was the only man in the room who wasn't moving. He had memorized the layout before the lights went out. He knew exactly where the heavy oak table was. He knew the angle of the coal chute. While the hitmen were tearing each other apart in friendly fire, Bumpy was pressed flat against the floor behind curing barrels, waiting for the storm to pass. Calm, patient, letting their own fear do the heavy lifting. The gunfire slowed. Magazines ran dry. The screaming turned into groans. That was the moment the dynamic shifted. The chaos ended. The hunt began. But the roles had flipped. Bumpy moved. He didn't use a gun. A gun gives away your position. He used the blade. He moved through the smoke like a wraith. He knew where they were by the sound of their heavy breathing, by the clicking of empty weapons, by the whimpers of the wounded. It was intimate, brutal work. Street justice isn't pretty. It isn't fair. It's efficient. A hand over a mouth. A quick, surgical strike. The sound of a body hitting the floor. Heavy. Wet. This is the part of the legend that earns Bumpy the title of Grandmaster. He didn't just survive the trap. He dismantled it with the precision of an engineer. He turned their numbers against them. He turned their weapons against them. He turned the dark into an ally. Finally, silence returned to the basement. The kind of ringing silence that leaves your ears aching. The air was thick with smoke. The floor was slick. One man left. The leader. The man who had smiled. He was backed into a corner, clutching a jammed pistol, his eyes wide, straining to see through the gloom. He was trembling. He heard a footstep. Then another. Slow. Deliberate. He realized then that the stories were true. He realized that this wasn't just a numbers runner. He had walked into a cage with a different species of predator entirely. A match flared to life. Bumpy Johnson stood 3 feet away, his suit barely ruffled, his face illuminated by the small, flickering flame. He wasn't holding a weapon anymore. He didn't need to. He looked at the last survivor who was sliding down the wall in terror. And he didn't offer mercy. He offered a message. Bumpy could have killed him. It would have been easy. A single cut. And the problem of Dutch Schultz's top enforcer would be over. But Bumpy understood something about power that Schultz never grasped. Dead men tell no tales. And he needed this tale told. He needed a witness. He grabbed the man by the lapels of his expensive coat, pulled him close enough to smell the smoke on his breath, and whispered 6 words. 6 words that would travel from that basement to the Bronx and echo all the way to the Italian mob's headquarters downtown. Tell Dutch. Harlem belongs to me. Then he did the unthinkable. He let him go. He watched the man scramble up the stairs, tripping over his own feet, running into the night like a child who had seen a ghost. Bumpy didn't leave immediately. He stood there for a moment in the dark, surrounded by the bodies of the men who had come to kill him, and he adjusted his tie. He walked out of that basement not as a survivor, but as a king. But here's the thing about that message. It wasn't just words. Bumpy handed the survivor something else, something he'd been carrying in his pocket. An ace of spades, a single playing card. In the underworld, the ace of spades meant one thing: death. But this card had something written on it. 11 names. The names of the 11 men who would never leave that basement. And at the bottom, one sentence: the money stays in Harlem. When the survivor got back to the Bronx at 3:15 a.m., he didn't just report a failed hit. He reported a nightmare. He walked into Dutch Schultz's office, hands shaking, clothes covered in blood and cordite, face white as a sheet. Schultz was sitting behind his desk, smoking a cigar, counting money. He looked up. Where's everyone else? The survivor couldn't speak. He just placed the ace of spades on Schultz's desk. The card was stained. Blood on the edges. 11 names written in neat handwriting. Schultz picked it up. Read the names. Read the message. The money stays in Harlem. For 10 seconds, Schultz said nothing, just stared at the card. Then he did something that shocked everyone in the room. He laughed. Not a happy laugh. A bitter, defeated laugh. The laugh of a man who just realized he'd made a catastrophic error. See, Schultz understood immediately what had happened. Bumpy Johnson had just demonstrated something more terrifying than any threat. He'd demonstrated capacity. The ability to turn 12 armed professionals into corpses. In the dark, without a gun. And then, this was the brilliant part, he'd sent a witness back. Not out of mercy. Out of strategy. Because a dead enforcer is a tragedy. But a traumatized enforcer telling everyone what happened, that's a legend. That's psychological warfare. That's a message that spreads faster than any bullet. Within 24 hours, every gangster in New York knew the story. The professor who fought 12 men in the dark and won. The man who couldn't be killed. It rattled Schultz. It rattled his men. Suddenly, the invincibility of the Bronx mob was shattered. Schultz wanted to escalate. He wanted to bring in heavy artillery. Send 50 men next time. Burn Harlem to the ground. But he had a problem. The noise was getting too loud. The bodies were piling up too high. And the real power in New York was watching. The Commission, the governing body of the Italian Mafia. See, the Mafia hates noise. Noise brings police. Noise brings prosecutors. Noise is bad for business. Lucky Luciano, the head of the commission, looked at the situation. He saw Dutch Schultz running a chaotic, bloody war over pennies. He saw Bumpy Johnson running a disciplined, impenetrable operation. Luciano didn't care about race. He cared about business. And he realized something critical. Bumpy Johnson wasn't someone you exterminated. He was someone you negotiated with. 2 weeks later, Schultz got a message. Not from Bumpy. From the commission. Stand down. We're handling this. Schultz had been declared a rogue agent. A loose cannon. The commission didn't eliminate him immediately, but they made it clear. The war with Harlem was over. And in October 1935, Dutch Schultz was gunned down in a restaurant bathroom in New Jersey. He died raving about his mother and his money. Meanwhile, Bumpy Johnson sat down with Lucky Luciano. 2 strategists, 2 kings. They didn't exchange gunfire. They exchanged terms. The agreement was simple. The Italian mob could operate in Harlem. But the numbers game, the heart of the community's economy, remained independent. Street Claire and Bumpy kept control. They paid a small tribute to the Commission for Peace, but they kept their sovereignty. It was a victory no one thought possible. A black gangster in 1,930 seconds, America forcing the most powerful criminal organization in the world to negotiate. As equals, Bumpy Johnson didn't just win a turf war. He carved out a kingdom. He proved that in the underworld, respect isn't given to the man with the biggest gun. It belongs to the man who knows when to shoot, when to cut the lights, and when to let the last witness live. Now here's where the story gets complicated. How much of that basement story is fact? How much is Harlem folklore? Did Bumpy really take out 12 men with a switchblade in the dark? Skeptics say it's impossible. They say it's a ghost story invented to scare rival crews. They say no man could survive that. But here's the thing about legends. They usually grow from a seed of hard truth. So let's separate what we know for sure from what legend says. What we know for sure, according to biography.com and allthatinteresting.com, Bumpy Johnson controlled the numbers racket in Harlem in partnership with Stephanie Street Claire. Fact: Dutch Schultz wanted to take over Harlem's numbers game in the early 1,930 seconds. Fact: there was violent conflict between Schultz's crew and Bumpy's operation. Fact: Schultz ultimately failed to take control of Harlem. Fact: Bumpy Johnson emerged from this conflict with his power intact and his reputation enhanced. Fact: the commission eventually intervened and negotiated peace. Fact: what's legend? The specific details of 12 versus 1 inch abasement. The Ace of Spades message. The exact choreography of the fight. Those details? Not in any official police record. Not in any court document. They come from oral history, from the streets of Harlem, from barbershop tales passed down for 90 years. So why does this story persist? Why has it survived for nearly a century? Because even if every detail isn't literally true, the story captures something that is true. Bumpy Johnson was capable of surviving impossible situations. He did use strategy over brute force. He did send messages that terrified his enemies. He did emerge victorious from conflicts where he was outnumbered and outgunned. The legend might embellish the details, but the core truth remains. Bumpy Johnson was the kind of man who could walk into a trap and turn it into a victory. In Harlem, they have a saying, "Ask any old-timer. They'll tell you it's true. And maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. But what matters is this. After that night, whether it happened exactly as the legend says or not, Dutch Schultz's invasion of Harlem stopped. The war ended. Bumpy's reputation became untouchable. And the message was clear to every gangster in New York. Don't mess with Harlem. Because Harlem has Bumpy Johnson. And Bumpy Johnson doesn't play by your rules. He writes his own. Sometimes the power of a story isn't in whether every detail is verifiable. It's in what the story represents. And this story represents something undeniable. In a world designed to crush him, Bumpy Johnson refused to be crushed. Whether he fought 12 men or not, he fought a system, and he won. That's not legend. That's documented history. After that night, everything changed. For the next 40 years, Bumpy Johnson was the undisputed godfather of Harlem, not just a crime boss, the gatekeeper. If you wanted to do business uptown, you paid Bumpy. If you wanted to open a club, you asked Bumpy. If you needed protection, you went to Bumpy. He turned the numbers racket into a stable, thriving economy that survived well into the 1,960 seconds. According to blackpast.org, Bumpy became known not just for his power, but for how he used it. He protected black-owned businesses from both white gangsters and corrupt police. He kept the Italian mob from completely taking over Harlem. He made sure the money from the numbers game stayed in the community. When someone needed rent money, Bumpy helped. When kids needed school supplies, Bumpy provided. When families faced eviction, Bumpy intervened. He was Robin Hood with a switchblade, a criminal with a code. To the FBI, he was a menace, a career criminal who spent decades in and out of prison, including time in Alcatraz. But to the people of Harlem, he was something else entirely. A protector, a shield, the man who stood between them and forces that would have destroyed them. He walked the streets of Lenox Avenue, not with bodyguards, but alone, tipping his hat to grandmothers, shaking hands with shopkeepers. He was protected by the people because he protected them. Other crime families learned to respect him, not because he was the most violent, but because he was the smartest. Lucky Luciano, head of the commission, once said, "Bumpy Johnson is the only black man in America I negotiate with as an equal." That wasn't charity. That was recognition of competence, of strategy, of power earned through intelligence rather than just violence. Bumpy's influence extended beyond crime. According to multiple sources, he had relationships with artists, musicians, and activists. He knew Duke Ellington. He protected Nat King Cole. And later in life, he mentored a young street hustler known as Detroit Red. He taught that kid strategy, dignity, how to think 5 moves ahead. That kid left the street life, changed his name, became Malcolm X. So, in a strange twist of history, the tactical brilliance that saved Bumpy Johnson in that basement in 1933 didn't just preserve a criminal empire. It helped shape a revolution. Bumpy Johnson died on July 7th, 1968. Heart attack. Age Tuctrids. He collapsed in a restaurant and died before the ambulance arrived. They say his last words were about Harlem, about protecting it, about making sure it stayed strong. His funeral was attended by thousands, not just criminals, community leaders, business owners, families whose rent he'd paid, kids whose education he'd funded, people who remembered that when the system failed them, Bumpy Johnson didn't. That's complicated legacy. He was a criminal. He broke laws. He hurt people. But he also protected a community when no one else would. He built power in a world that denied black men any legitimate path to power. He used illegal means to create something that mattered to people who had nothing. That doesn't make crime right, but it makes it understandable. And it makes Bumpy Johnson more than just a gangster. It makes him a product of his time, a survivor of a system designed to destroy him, a man who refused to be destroyed. See, here's what most people miss about this story. It's not about violence. It's about strategy. Anyone can pull a trigger. Any thug can start a war. But Bumpy Johnson understood something deeper. Violence is expensive. Violence is loud. Violence brings attention. Violence creates enemies who want revenge. But strategy? Strategy wins wars without firing shots. Strategy creates respect that lasts generations. Strategy turns disadvantages into advantages. That night in the basement, whether it happened exactly as legend says or not, represents a philosophy. When you're outnumbered, you change the game. When you can't outshoot them, you outthink them. When they expect violence, you deliver psychology. Bumpy Johnson understood something about power that Dutch Schultz never grasped. Respect isn't given, it's earned. And it's earned not by being the most brutal, but by being the most effective. Schultz had more guns, more men, more money. But Bumpy had something Schultz didn't. He had a code. He understood that in the underworld, your reputation is your currency. Kill 11 men and send one back with a message? That's not murder. That's communication. That's building a legend that protects you better than any army. Because after that night, nobody wanted to fight Bumpy Johnson. Not because they thought they'd lose. Because they thought even if they won, the cost wouldn't be worth it. That's genius-level strategy. And it applies far beyond the criminal world. In business, the most successful people aren't the most aggressive. They're the most strategic. They know when to fight and when to negotiate, when to dominate and when to collaborate, when to make noise and when to move in silence. In leadership, the most respected leaders aren't the ones who yell loudest. They're the ones who command respect through competence, through consistency, through understanding that true power doesn't need to announce itself. Bumpy Johnson proved that the strongest position isn't standing over your enemy with a gun. It's standing in a way that makes your enemy choose not to fight in the first place. That's why this story matters today. We live in a world of instant reactions. Social media outrage, quick judgments, loud responses. But Bumpy Johnson's approach was different. Calculate first, react second. Understand psychology before you use force. Build reputation so you don't need violence. That's timeless wisdom. Whether you're running a business, leading a team, or just navigating life, the lesson is the same. Strategy beats force. Intelligence beats anger. Patience beats impulsiveness. And the person who controls their response controls the outcome. Bumpy Johnson could have panicked when his money was stolen. Could have started a war he couldn't win. Could have run. Instead, he calculated. He planned. He executed perfectly. And he turned a disaster into a legend. That's not criminal thinking. That's master-level strategic thinking. And that's why 90 years later, we're still telling this story. Not because violence is admirable, but because intelligence always deserves respect. February 14th, 1933, 4:33 a.m. Bumpy Johnson woke up to find $50,000 gone. By sunrise, he knew exactly who stole it. By sunset, he'd walked into a basement with 12 armed men. And by midnight, he'd walked out alone, carrying a message that would echo through Harlem for generations. This is the story of how intelligence beat violence, how strategy beat brute force, how one man with nothing but his mind turned a trap into a triumph. Dutch Schultz had the guns, had the men, had the power, but Bumpy Johnson had something more valuable. He had the plan. He had the patience. He had the code. And in the end, that's what won. Not the biggest gun, the smartest mind. That's the legacy of Bumpy Johnson. Not just a gangster, a grandmaster, a strategist, a man who proved that respect isn't given. It's earned. one calculated move at a time. If this story changed how you think about power and strategy, hit that subscribe button. We're telling the stories history forgot. The real stories. The complicated stories. The stories that show how intelligence shaped the underworld. Drop a comment. What would you have done in Schultz's position after getting that message? Would you have escalated? Or would you have backed down like he did? Hit the like button if you think Bumpy Johnson was the smartest gangster in American history. And turn on notifications because next week, we're covering the time Bumpy Johnson walked into Lucky Luciano's office unarmed and walked out as an equal. The meeting that changed organized crime forever. You don't want to miss that. Remember, Harlem didn't need the biggest guns. It had the smartest strategist. And that made all the difference. Rest in power, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the professor, the grandmaster, the man who proved that in a world of violence, intelligence always wins. This is Harlem Chronicles, telling the stories they don't want you to know. We'll see you in the next one.